All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for attending this month's SACS Monthly talk. Our speaker is Dr. Christopher Barrett. He's a assistant professor in Department of Mechanical Engineering at Mississippi State University. And he is speaking on Genesis, History of Myth. This is the part 2 of his talks. You can check out our YouTube page if you would like to view the first part. So with that, I will turn over to Dr. Barrett.
Thanks, Michael. And one other thing I will mention before I get into this, it's always hard to spread the word when we're going to do one of these, especially since it's online and we don't have a set schedule right now. So if you would like to be sure to get contacted every time we're planning one of these, shoot Nye on an email. Her email address is down there at the bottom of this slide, and you can get put on our email list. So with that, I'll first give a really high-level introduction to what this talk is going to be about. And in essence, it's about the book of Genesis and what the book of Genesis says and what it means for us now living in the modern world, being surrounded by the advancements of science and so forth. And it makes some factual statements that can be hard to reconcile with what we hear from the world around us. In particular, it says there is a creator, that everything was created at a certain point in time, the beginning. It says that the heavens and the earth, the sea, and everything there is was made in 6 days, and that man was created from the dust of the ground. He did not evolve from lower beings, but he was specifically created, and God made him a living soul in his own image. So if you saw the first talk, I talked a lot about the evidence that there is a creator versus no creator. I talked about that there is a complex coding in all life forms' DNA. I talked about the fossil record and how many life forms just suddenly appear with no development before that or in deeper layers. There's the fact that the universe definitely had a beginning. It doesn't go infinitely back in time. And entropy increases over time. So all of these things indicate strong evidence that a creator exists rather than life having arisen from natural processes. And last time we talked about the scientific method, because there's this idea that science and religion are naturally enemies because science must find a natural explanation for everything it studies. I argued, though, that that's not a valid definition of science. The science should seek truth in the most reasonable way it can, whether that means identifying supernatural causes or causes that cannot be explained, or natural causes, as the case may be. But to try to come up with an extremely implausible natural explanation for something that looks like an outside effect caused it is not good science. And so if you take as a hypothesis that the creator really exists and that the world was made by a god or the god, you could treat that as a scientific hypothesis and look for evidence to prove or disprove it just the way you would with any other hypothesis in the scientific method. And my experience suggests that anyone who takes this process with an open mind would come to the conclusion that the evidence for a creator outweighs any arguments against one. So that's how I approach science. And I am a scientist. I do scientific research and I publish journal articles. And I study mostly materials at the atomistic scale. You can see some of my results down below here. So I've had to deal with this conflicting of two different methods of finding truth, religion and science. And my way of reconciling them has been to conclude that the ultimate truth is the most important thing, more than the method of finding truth. Also, there's evidence from creation that God exists. The Bible itself is highly self-consistent. and is clear and reliable. I found it so in my own life, and it's been so throughout history. Moreover, I think God created me to understand his world and understand him. He created beings that would want to worship him of their own will. So that's important. And it explains the way I see the world, and explains that I would expect the world to be explainable, to be consistent. And so in that way, religion actually provides a justification for science's success. And finally, God wants to be found. And the evidence that God has left throughout the world is profound, that he does exist and that he cares about us. So that's how I approach science, with religion as a foundation for it. So with that, now let's get into some of the specifics of this talk. There are several different claims throughout the book of Genesis, specific things that Genesis says that are disputed now. And there's different approaches for how people would dispute them. Not all of them would just say, well, Genesis is wrong. Some of them will tell you that it's actually a beautiful allegory, or it's some kind of poetry, or it's alluding to something in a way that we don't understand, or it's not been translated properly. You know, there's lots of different explanations. So I'm not interested in getting into the weeds of that. My view is, if there is a creator God, and he wrote the Bible for us to understand him, then he would take care for the Bible to be understandable and clear in its meaning. So if the book of Genesis makes specific historical claims, I expect them to be reliable. So here's some claims it makes. God created the world in 6 days with all the kinds of plants and animals we see now. It says there was a global cataclysmic flood that covered the whole earth. And it says the earth is less than 10,000 years old. All of those things run amok of a secular evolutionary theory. And so they're disputed mainly for that reason. So let's get into them in a little more detail. In Genesis chapter 1, the Bible says that God created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh day. Later in the book of Exodus, when God is proclaiming the 10 Commandments for the first time, he explains that the Sabbath day is to be holy because God created the world in 6 days and rested in the Sabbath. Now, the whole justification for the Sabbath day doesn't make a lot of sense if he wasn't talking about 6 explicit days, just the way our week is structured now. So I think, the meaning is pretty clear there. It's intended to be understood as a week. So on the first day of the week, God created light and separated it from darkness. Notice it's not possible to have days without light, because that's what defines them, is the time period of light, the time period of darkness. Interestingly enough, he didn't create the sun until later. On day 2, he created the sky, the heavens, the firmament, which I would take to mean all of space above the earth, which was at that time still empty. On day 3, he'd created the continents, as it were. He'd separated the dry land from the ocean, and he created the vegetation on the dry land, all the plants and trees. On day 4, he created the sun, moon, and stars. On day 5, he created all of the creatures in the ocean and the birds of the air. On day 6, he created all of the land animals and man. And then on the 7th day, he rested. So it has a sort of poetic feel to it, but it's written in a very matter-of-fact way as well. But this is what God did. It's not written as if it's to be understood as a fairy tale. In Genesis chapters 6 through 8, or 9, I think it is, it describes the events of Noah's flood, which I don't know why you'd name it after Noah. He was the only one, apparently, that didn't deserve it, but that's what we call it today. So, in the 600th year of Noah's life, there was a flood. Noah had been warned ahead of time by God, commanded to build a huge ark to preserve himself and all of the land animals. The flood is described in an interesting way. it talks about water erupting out of the ground and it raining for 40 days. So there was water coming from below and above at the same time. It says the entire earth was covered, including the mountain peaks, to a depth of 15 cubits it gives, actually. And it explicitly says that all animals and people were drowned except those on the ark. That statement is repeated in other places in the Bible, actually. So that's important. And finally, it stopped raining after the first 40 days, but the waters did not recede completely until about a full year after the flood started. About halfway through that period, the ark came to rest on the Mount Ararat, but there was still water all around it until quite a while afterward. And then finally, the third claim I want to deal with tonight is the Genesis claims the earth is young. Now, many people aren't familiar enough with the book of Genesis and the rest of the Bible to know exactly why it is that the earth must be young if the Bible is taken literally. So here's where the numbers come from. If you go through Genesis 5, it gives the genealogy from Adam to Noah. And it gives specifically how old each person was when their son was born, as well as how old they were when they died and other things. So if you add up these numbers from the creation of Adam until the flood, you get very clearly 1,656 years from that passage. From there, Genesis 11 continues the genealogy, starting with the flood and ending in Abraham. If you again add up the numbers, you get that Abraham was born 352 years after the flood. Then you have to pick from several different passages that continue the genealogy down, because there's a lot of details given about the life of Abraham, his son Isaac, his grandsons, and so on. But Isaac was born when Abraham was 100. Jacob and Esau were born when Isaac was 60. Jacob was 130 years old when they moved to Egypt. And the children of Israel were in Egypt for 430 years. Then we jump way forward, and it says in 1 Kings 6:1 that the temple was started 480 years after the Israelites left Egypt. And at the time, Solomon had reigned 3 years. Now, if you look up when King Solomon reigned in Judea, or in Israel, you get about 1000 BC. There is some variation in the date because the different kings that came after him had somewhat overlapping reigns. And we know exactly when Jerusalem was taken by Nebuchadnezzar, but the exact period from Solomon to there is not certain to better than within about 30 years. So I just put it at 1000 BC plus or minus 30 years, and that pretty much agrees with all of the scholarship. So if you take all of those numbers and then add 2021 to that at the end, you'll get a total of 6,225 years from creation to now. Now, there are some variations in literal interpretations as to exactly, when you do things like that plus or minus 30 years, and other places have been interpreted differently, like how long the children of Israel were in Egypt, how old how old Terah was when Abraham was born, and so on. And then there's differences in manuscripts too. The Septuagint gives different ages for each father when the son was born. But even if you take the longest time period you could from every manuscript and every interpretation, you're still not going to get more than about 1,500 years more to add to this number. And there's not really anywhere in the whole narrative where you could insert really big gaps without making the passage look deceptive. So basically, you can assume Genesis is not telling accurate history, or you can accept that the earth is well less than 10,000 years old. There's not any other option. So let's talk about briefly some of the non-literal interpretations that do allow for an old earth. And there's several different ones. And also, I put in here a local flood because that's usually tied in with those. So the first one of the more popular ones, is the idea that there was a big gap of time between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2. And in fact, many people have postulated that there was even a pre-Adam race that existed in this period, and that accounts for the fossil record and everything else that we see now. This was popularized quite a long time ago in the 1800s and has been popular ever since. So this was developed to try to make Genesis more compatible with evolutionary theory, the fossil record, the age of the earth being in the millions, and so on. But it has some serious theological problems because it requires, in fact, death to come well before Adam's sin. And it conflicts with passages like Romans 8, which say that creation groans because of Adam's sin, when in fact the corruption and the death and everything else in creation would have existed before Adam in this view. So that's a problem. And then of course there's the problem that it's highly non-literal in itself. Genesis, if it's written to be understood, should not have huge gaps like this where the text does not indicate that there is one. Another popular view is that each day described in Genesis 1 was actually many eons of time. This has even worse issues in my view, because, for example, plants are created before the sun. Genesis, talking about 6 days being the foundation of the week, and Exodus affirming the sacredness of the Sabbath day, becomes almost complete nonsense because there's no such thing as 6 days anymore, and then the seventh to rest on, because it was all just eons of time. They weren't even the same length. And then, of course, there's still huge conflicts between this view and evolutionary theory. This has birds created before land animals, for example. And so it really doesn't help either side very much unless you go in and say that even the days as they were described were not really that way. They weren't even in the same order. Then you could make that work, but it would just make Genesis 1 kind of nonsense. So that's the issues with that. Another view that's been postulated, it's not as popular, is that the time period from Adam to Noah, or more particularly from Adam to Abraham, were actually much, much longer. And millions of years perhaps occurred during these periods. And these were some notable families that arose during those time periods. The family of Adam, the family of Seth, and so on, going on down, which contradicts the text of Genesis and still conflicts heavily with evolution too, because evolution insists that man evolved from apes during this time, whereas this view still has man, named man Adam, created on day 6 of creation. So it's basically a compromise, like the previous one, between a literal Genesis and a secular origin that includes some of the weakest points of both views. There's also a lot of issues with the idea of a local flood. Many people interpret the flood of Genesis as a local event because that way it's reconcilable with secular history. Never mind that the rest of Genesis doesn't reconcile with secular history. But if you just want to make the flood make sense, you can just say, well, it was a local event in the Middle East, and that's why they wrote about it. That doesn't really make any sense with the way the flood is described, though. For example, you wouldn't try to gather up breeding pairs of animals to preserve them for a local flood, because after a local flood, animals will migrate back in from around the outside of the flooded region. There's no need to preserve the animals, and it's a whole lot of work. There is obviously the issue that the Bible clearly states the flood covered the world and everything died, which is a pretty big problem for a local flood view. And then finally, if you go all the way to the New Testament, Peter writes that the flood destroyed the old world, just like our world will be destroyed by fire. Now, I don't know of anybody that says that God's judgment of our world will be a local event. We might like to think that, but it certainly doesn't sound that way, and it makes no sense of Peter's analogy if you take the flood as a local event. That ties into the final view, which is that the entirety of the early book of Genesis, up until Abraham in chapter 12, is allegorical. It has the problems of the gap theory too. It has death coming before sin, which is a major theological problem, because the Bible is very clear in the New Testament that sin came from Adam's action, the rebellion of Adam, and death came because there was sin. That made the way open for Christ to redeem us. Christ's obedience and his righteousness in life and death is what made possible the gift of eternal life that is now offered back to us. So if Jesus' death and our redemption are no allegories, then Christianity brings us hope. If they are allegories, then Christianity is just a myth in itself. But if you say that Christ died literally, and we are redeemed literally from death and sin, then why would you say that the origin of sin and death were allegories? That doesn't make any sense. So I have major problems with that view from a theological perspective. It makes God out to be some kind of a charlatan. So, in conclusion, over all of that, New Testament writers are very clear that the Bible was actual events. They describe them that way, compare them to upcoming events, talk about them and their theological implications. So as best I can see, there's four possibilities. Either the New Testament writers knew Genesis was allegory and compared it to actual events to be confusing, or they thought Genesis was history, but they were wrong, or they knew Genesis was history and it really is, or finally, the writings that we have don't accurately preserve what they said. So, in essence, I find that 3 is the only satisfactory explanation. If you take 4, you really have to throw out the whole Bible, which makes our faith in vain and is not well upheld by the actual evidence. 1 and 2 are just nonsense and conflict with the character of God. 4 actually conflicts with the character of God as well. So that brings us to the quandary we have. We have observations of the world. We have the secular interpretations of those observations. But is there evidence that the different kinds were created rather than evolving from one ancestor? Is there evidence of a recent global flood? Is there evidence that the Earth is younger than 10,000 years? I mean, can we take the evidence, the actual observations we have, and reconcile them with what Genesis says literally? And I think we can. So let's go through some of that stuff. So first of all, regarding creation of the kinds of living things, it needs to be clear that kind and species is not the same thing. Genesis does not say that all of the many, many species we have today were created on day 6 of creation. It also does not say that there's not divergence of where you have one species that becomes 2. God probably only created one ancestor to all the wolves, dogs, and coyotes in the world now. One ancestor kind. Those things actually can still breed with one another and make hybrids, just like donkeys and horses can breed together and make mules. Lions and tigers can breed together. The modern term we have, species, is not very clearly defined. So the concept of a kind is something that's a little broader than that. It means, animals that actually did have a common ancestor and that you can see from their genetic code and from their breeding compatibility without having to resort to really complex mutations and inventing evolutionary processes that seem implausible. So another issue with the living kinds is they had to fit on the ark for Genesis to make sense. So modern creation scientists have actually analyzed this. They've tried to catalog how many different actual kinds of animals they are, how much space they would take up, how much space the food would take up to keep them all fed for a year. And they've concluded that with the enormous size that the ark was, it's given as 450 feet by 75 feet for each level, and 3 levels tall. That's the size of the ark. It's enormous. And they've concluded that that was big enough, that you actually could plausibly store all the different kinds of animals and food for them, and living space for 8 people and food for them as well on the ark for a year. So, is there evidence that different kinds of animals were created originally rather than evolving? And yes, there is. For one thing, the fossil record has become somewhat notorious for missing links, as it were. People talk about missing links all the time. Well, the problem is they're still missing, and they have been ever since evolution was invented. And even the ones that they talk about that they've discovered the missing link and so on, most of them are almost identical to existing animals or extinct ones. They're not really transitional forms. So like of these different skulls here that are shown in this picture from a National Geographic article, all of them are almost identical to apes or almost identical to human skulls. There's not any that are right in the middle, even though they're labeled that way. If you look more broadly at the fossil record and the different families of animals, you actually see that almost all the major groups of animals suddenly occurred at once in the Cambrian fossil layer, with some of them being more recent, a few penetrating lower, but almost all at once. There's not a gradual family tree pattern going back through deeper and deeper layers. Instead, you just see all the animals at once. So that conflicts fairly heavily with the evolutionary view and is much better aligned with the concept of a specific creation event somewhat recently. So if the kinds are okay, if we have decent evidence that can explain what we see just as well or better than evolutionary theory, what about the flood? Because the flood should leave major fingerprints in the world around us. So does it? Well, it turns out creation scientists use the same evidence to argue for a global flood that evolutionary scientists use to argue for millions of years of gradual accumulation. They use the fossil record, the many layers of rock going from the Cambrian layer up. So creation scientists argued that practically all of this was created in a 1-year period by just the consecutive laying down of all of these different layers by channels of water as the flood waters rose and then fell again and drained out. So we can ask the question, does the actual data support the idea of a recent flood? And then considering we're using the same data that the secular scientists are for a lot of this, which one does it support better? A recent flood or millions of years of gradual accumulation? So to answer that, we need to first do a little bit of a background in geology. Because the flood was a cataclysmic event, it didn't just happen by a lot of rain falling. You had a lot of very dramatic processes happen to make a global flood. So one thing that is observed today is that there are many different continental plates that make up the crust of the earth, and they're all moving. The ocean plate here, this might be, for instance, the Pacific plate, with the mountainous one there being the California plate. And the Pacific plate is gradually moving under the California plate, which is causing energy buildup, and you're getting volcanic activity, you're getting earthquakes because of the force of that happening. Well, Dr. John Baumgartner realized some years ago that if you take the idea of the continental plates moving and you backtrack where they would have been in the past, that you can find out how a global flood event could have occurred by having them move very rapidly. So he takes the whole concept of the plates moving around and all of the millions of years and everything, and just speeds up the whole process, and then asks, well, does the science still work? Can we make a model that explains all of this? And so he did a bunch of computer simulations and found out that it is plausible to have tectonic plates plunging down into the mantle at meters per second. I mean, really rapid movement for continental plates, which would cause major havoc in terms of earthquakes, tsunamis, lava eruptions, steam rising, all these different things. And if you take it all together, it would cause a major flood event. So here's the simulation that was done based on his model of what the continental movement could look like before, during, and after a flood event of that magnitude. So his idea was that basically you start with the same or similar continental arrangement that secular geologists used for very, very long ago. And then you run it forward at a very fast rate through the flood, and then gradually dropping off to the current movement rate of the continents, rather than it happening over billions of years. So I'll just kind of walk through this over time here, and you can start to see them moving around, and then you see them in our current arrangement. So let me run that again. So you start here, and you can't really recognize any of them hardly, but you start to see it moving around. So this is what's called Pangea. This would be near the beginning of the flood. And then you can start to see North America breaking off. You see Africa and South America are still completely joined together into Guandala. You see them starting to break apart here. You see the Great Lakes area there is completely submerged. See Florida starting to rise up out of the ocean. You see India in its present position now, finally. So that was the model. And it works actually over millions of years or very quickly. The numbers indicate that both processes could happen. So then I have to ask, well, how much water do you need to cover the Earth? Because if you're going to cover up all of the mountains, it seems like you need way more water than there is possible. I mean, you can't just make it rain until the mountains are covered up by water. However, if the Earth were flat, there'd be enough water in the oceans to cover everything a mile deep. You just have to move it around. We know that earthquakes, which cause tsunamis, can bring a whole lot of water out of the ocean and onto the continents. We also agree that the continental movement is what produced the high mountains we have today. So at the beginning of the flood, if Dr. Baumgartner's model is correct, there were not any high mountains. There would only be hills. So major tsunami events, enormous tsunamis like would occur from really rapid plate movement, would create these waves that would just wash over the entire continent at once and deluge the entire thing. So it's very scientifically plausible for the current water we have in our oceans to rise up, cover the land, the continents to move around and form the current arrangement we see today. and the Earth be completely covered with water. You don't have to invent water from outer space and then siphon it away. You don't have to do anything crazy. So if that happened, what would be the evidence we have to show for it today? I mean, it's such a large cataclysm, we can hardly even imagine it. But we do know we should see huge erosion channels, which we do. We should see millions of dead things that are fossilized in sediment layers laid down by water all over the world, and we do. We should see widespread legends of a cataclysmic flood in diverse cultures, and we do. So the flood is compatible with the evidence out there. It may not be popular, but it is compatible. So then that raises the question, but what about the evidence of the Earth being ancient? Because it's treated as complete fact that the Earth is 4 billion years old, and all of the stuff associated with that. Man arose some 3 million years ago, and we had dinosaurs 65 million years ago, and all of this stuff. The numbers are considered established. So if the flood can explain the fossil record about as well as the secular model, how is it they're so confident of these numbers? Well, there's many different methods that are used to date the world, or to date different parts of the world, or different things in the world. Here's a list of many of them. There's many, many more than this. But you can see that, you know, there's different logical means you can use to say, well, this has been occurring for so long based on the rate at which it's decaying or whatever. Most of these give ages which are much less than the 4.6 billion years that the Earth is called old. Many of the processes actually produce an upper limit rather than a lower limit or an exact figure. To give you an example of what that means, Lord Kelvin once did a calculation knowing the sun's mass, and he said, well, what if the sun were made completely of coal? How long would it take to burn out? And he came up with a figure of some 10,000 years or so. Now, he didn't know about nuclear fusion, of course, because he predated the discovery of that. But he gave that figure as this is how long the sun can burn, if it's made completely of coal. Now, if the sun is made up of coal plus some non-flammable material, then it would have to be less than that. That's an example of an upper limit. So many of these dating methods are based on the most lengthy assumption that you could put for that particular thing. So here's one example where what we observe conflicts with what the age of it is supposed to be. Galaxies are supposed to be 10 billion years old. However, the orbital speeds of the stars conflict with that. The galaxies should have exploded, basically. And so to keep them stable, the scientists have invented something called dark matter, which there's utterly no data to support, other than the fact that the stars are orbiting around the centers of the galaxies, and there doesn't seem to be enough gravity to make them do that at the speeds they're going. If you let the Earth be young, there's no problem there. Here's another one. We know that stars burn out when they get old. We've seen this occur. The Crab Nebula is one of the more famous ones here. It was observed by Chinese astronomers to go supernova in 1054. We know about how frequently stars should go supernova, and we've observed it over the decades. It's been somewhat rare, but we've seen enough of them to get an idea. But we only have about 200 remnants in our galaxy that we've identified. And based on the number of stars in our galaxy, there should be much, much more supernovas or supernova remnants that we can see because they leave behind these smoke rings. There's only about 7,000 years worth, judging by how frequently the stars do it at current rates. Here's another one. Comets when they orbit around the sun, disintegrate. The tail material burns off. Now, comets have a finite mass, so that means after enough orbits, they burn up completely and they are no more. The lifetime of a comet in the solar system is less than 10,000 years based on the masses of a typical comet. So, where did the comets come from? Well, secular astronomers say that there's some kind of a cloud of comet material way out beyond the sun that just occasionally spits one out into the solar system. We've not seen any documentation to support that idea. In fact, we just see the comets. They come, sometimes they burn out. We don't know. I mean, it makes far more sense that they've just been here since the beginning and they're burning out over time. Here's another one. Seafloor mud accumulates too fast. The Mississippi River puts a ton of mud into the Gulf of Mexico every year. Mud leaves the Gulf of Mexico and other places in the ocean through the movement of the continental plates, but at a much slower rate. We can measure how much mud is on the plate at the ocean floor now. If you take all those things together, it must have been accumulating for a maximum of 12 million years, which is far less than the currently understood ages of our oceans and rivers. The rivers also put salt into the ocean and other minerals. There are very limited processes which remove salt, the drying up along the seashores and so on. The oceans are getting measurably saltier over time because of this. If you backtrack, you can conclude that the oceans were completely fresh 62 million years ago using the current rates. So why did the rivers not start putting salt into the ocean until 62 million years ago? Or why did the rate at which they put salt into the ocean increase dramatically? It's not been explained. The Earth's magnetic field is losing energy too fast. It loses half its energy every 1,400 years. Now that's different from it reversing direction or changing direction. Those things happen too, but every time it changes, it's losing energy, and the energy doesn't just come back. Now, we don't understand very well exactly where the magnetic field comes from. We know that there's iron, molten iron flowing around in the core, and that's what produces the magnetic field. But it's not at all clear whether there's any process that would increase its energy. It seems very unlikely at best. And at the rate it's losing it, it can't possibly have been doing this for more than 20,000 years. There's also the issue that biological material decays too fast. DNA mutations accumulate over time. Genetic diseases are more common than they used to be. The removal of unfit DNA is not at a sufficient rate to reverse this process. So DNA-based organisms should have all gone extinct by now if they were as old as the secular evolutionists say they are. Oh, that's got noise. I don't like the noise, but anyway. There. Okay, so we've measured DNA many different ways and many different forms. And we found a lot of issues with it being as old as secular evolutionists want it to be. Take the dinosaurs, for example. We've actually found soft tissue from dinosaurs now. It's not fossilized. It's actually still soft. It hasn't rotted. So how can you possibly explain that if it's 70 million years old? Here's another one that's very simple to understand. If humans existed for 2.9 million years, say, before they became advanced, why don't we have Stone Age graves for all of that time? there should be over 6 billion graves based on, just being hunter-gatherer in form. And there's very few graves. Written history is too short. This one's similar to the last one. So written history started about 4,500 years ago. There's some fragments a little bit older than that. But why in the world did people not invent writing earlier if modern man has existed for so long? What I've seen mostly from secular views regarding this sort of thing is they ascribe a current rate of evolution to mankind, which is vastly higher than what they claim has historically been present. So it doesn't really make any sense. So in conclusion, creation is young. Most of the dating methods agree that creation is young. Both the heavens, the earth, and life are young based on the different clocks we have. So why is it that most geologists and other scientists say that the earth is undeniably ancient? Well, they use radioisotope dating, and that, they say, is the only reliable dating mechanism because it's the only one that gives ages as old as what they need for evolution to be plausible at all. So radioactive dating makes some assumptions, a good many assumptions, in order to work and give you these ancient dates. Carbon dating is used for living things, and potassium argon or uranium lead dating is used for non-living things, rocks, for example. Radioactive decay occurs at a certain rate, which is constant. It seems to be constant no matter what the temperature or the pressure is or what's going on outside, so it makes a very good clock. But we aren't sure that it's always been constant because we don't really know how it works very well. So, overall, that's an assumption, but it seems to be a pretty good one. However, there are other assumptions which aren't so good. For example, C14 has always been at the same concentration in the air as it is now. So in order to measure how long something has been dead, you need to measure how much C14 has decayed from when it was alive. And to do that, you need to know how much C14 it had when it was alive. So you have to assume that the rate that you either know that number or it's the same as it is now, or something else similar to that. That one's not a good assumption because we know for sure that the C14 amount in the atmosphere is varied through time. You also have to assume that no leaching occurred, meaning that C14 didn't actively leave the material or get added to the material during the time it was buried in the ground. So that's the two boundary conditions: nothing coming in, nothing going out. And of course, you have to assume that there wasn't way more C14 to begin with for some reason. Maybe an animal ate a fossil or something. So the way C14 works is cosmic radiation reacts with nitrogen and produces radioactive carbon in the atmosphere, which is in carbon dioxide gas. The carbon dioxide gas we have has a certain percentage, which is C14, which is radioactive, rather than the normal C12, which is not radioactive. It's a very small percentage. 1 out of every trillion carbon atoms in the atmosphere is radioactive. All living things interact with the carbon in the atmosphere. The plants absorb it directly and emit oxygen. The animals eat the plants and thereby absorb the carbon. And it makes up one of the key components of everything in our bodies. So, but indirectly, we absorb the carbon-14 from the atmosphere. The amount of it in our bodies has the same ratio of C14 to C12 as what's in the atmosphere right now. So then if you have something that died however long ago, we can measure how much has decayed since then, and you can work out how old it is if the amount in the atmosphere when it died was the same as it is now. Well, I've got a plot for that actually. So the C14 decays over time at this rate. It's not a straight line. Half of it decays every 5,200 years. So after 10,000 years, there'll be a quarter left, and then 15,000 years, there'll be an eighth left, and so on. However, when it comes to actual samples, where they've measured it with other types of radioisotope dating, and then measured it with C14, they get wildly conflicting results. So here is a piece of wood from Queensland, Australia, which has a C14-based age of 44,000 years, and the age that it's labeled, perhaps based on where it was in the geological column, is 33 million years. So if this thing actually was laid down in that column at the time they said it was, there should be no measurable C14 left. Now, that could be because the boundary conditions were violated and absorbed some later, or it could be because it's not really 33 million years old. Here's another example, this one from England. So they saw this piece of wood, which was inside the rock. The rock is dated at 185 million years. The wood is dated at 24,000 years. Now, it doesn't look like to me that the wood somehow got in there after the rock was laid down. So that's a bit of an issue. Here's a piece of coal. This one's again from Australia. And once again, the coal seam was dated at 250 million years. The C14 age was 33,700 years. So all of that goes to show, basically, you can't just rely on the radioisotope dating. The different types of radioisotope dating disagree with one another, and the amount of carbon-14 dating disagrees with the accepted age of the part of the rock that it's found in many times. Furthermore, much of the C14 ratios that we've seen seem to be about the same value, regardless of the supposed age of the sample. So many times people have actually considered this to be a background noise value and just subtracted it out of their sample before dating it. But that's not justified by any scientific theory. It's just something that people have done to get numbers they wanted. However, if you take it that all of the stuff was laid down during a single year, then you would expect that the ratios would all be about the same value, regardless of how deep in the rock they are. So some creationists have said that there's evidence that C14 ratio we have now is much higher than it was before the flood. And that would explain why they're still getting dates that are a good bit older than the Earth could be based on Genesis. They've justified this, for example, by looking at a single woolly mammoth, which was encased in ice, and then we recovered. The leg bones of it were dated at one age, and the ribs at a different age. And so they argued that that was because the formation of the mammoth occurred when the atmospheric concentration of carbon-14 was varying considerably. And so that explains why there's different amounts in different parts of the animal. The Genesis flood definitely removed a lot of carbon from the atmosphere, or from the biosphere, because there was a lot more plants than there are now. So that could plausibly affect the C14 ratio. It's not entirely clear how. So there's a good bit more work to be done here from a creationist point of view. So what about the other dating methods? So we've already seen the conflict with C14. What about other things. Is there other ways to ascertain whether the uranium-lead dating, for example, the potassium-argon dating, are reliable or not? Because they are considered to be gospel truth. Now, the uranium dating is the only way you can get 4 billion years. That's the only clock that lasts long enough to measure dates that large. So, some time ago, there was actually a group of creation scientists that managed to get up enough funding to do their own research, their own new research, and gather their own data to try to prove that these dating methods are not reliable. So here's what they did. There's these tiny crystals that are found in different parts of the Earth's crust called zircon crystals. These crystals contain uranium and thorium atoms, which are radioactive. And the uranium decays over time into lead. In the process, it emits helium atoms progressively. Now, helium is very small. So the helium that is emitted inside these zircon crystals is able to move out of the zircons. So it moves through, like water through a sponge. So over time, you would expect all of the helium atoms to go away, because just even with random movement, it's more likely for them to move out permanently than to just stay in there. So they got some of these zircon crystals. They dated them based on the uranium content, the radioactive uranium, 234, 235, and they measured the amount of helium in them. And they found out that there's actually quite a lot of helium left in most of the samples, which then begs the question, how are these zircons as old as the uranium dating says they are? Because if they're like a sponge, they shouldn't still have any measurable helium in them. It should have moved out by now. So that raises some major questions for the uranium dating. You basically have these two different clocks. The helium diffusion rate says that these things can't be more than 8,000 years old. The uranium decay says they're 1.5 billion years old. Dramatically different results here. So the rate team argued that the decay rate of uranium could have been much higher in the past. Now, there's still a good bit of work to be done on that, because we don't know how the rate could have been higher. But the data does support that there is something not explained by the secular argument that uranium dating is incontrovertible. So it's clear that there's problems that they aren't explaining, that they're just ignoring. So in conclusion with this part, secular scientists have taken the dating methods that they want, which give them the data that is compatible with evolution, and they've said that that is completely reliable, that it can't be questioned. If you look at the data itself, it's not nearly so conclusive. So, we just looked at a few of these dating methods now, and we've seen that most of them produce major problems for saying that the Earth is ancient. There's only one or two that can give you those dates that are as long ago as they say they are, and even those seem to conflict with other dating methods in ways that are not explained. The thing about science is it's always in progress. Scientific theory should never be taken as unquestionable. Science should always be questioned. The Bible is different, of course. It's not meant to be questioned or criticized. It's meant to just be taken on faith. But when we do take it on faith, and then we look at the world, we see that it does not conflict with what we see. We see that the world is completely compatible with these three statements, that God created it in 6 days with the kinds of plants and animals we see today, that there could have been a global flood, and we have evidence that supports that idea. And we see that there's many dating methods that indicate that the Earth is quite young, not billions of years old. So, takeaways. Why do I believe what I do? I don't believe what I do just because I think the Bible is unquestionable and can't be questioned no matter what data is presented to me. I don't believe what I do because I was raised that way. I don't believe what I do even because the evidence of creation says that. I believe what I do because I know the God of the Bible. He's revealed himself to me personally. That's the only thing that has provided me with enough faith to say these things and to not have any doubt in my mind at all that they're the truth. Supporting that, supporting my personal relationship, is the fact that the revelation in my heart, the Bible itself, and the creation are all consistent with each other. There's not any disagreement, any contradictions between them. So what are you going to take away from this? I hope you can take away the following. Science doesn't rule out or disprove the Bible, even though some people say it does. You can still be a good scientist and be a good Christian at the same time. You don't have to pick one over the other. The evidence supports incontrovertibly that there is a designer, that things did not arise naturally with no outside influence, and that there is compatible evidence for a literal interpretation of Genesis for the young earth. Now, I wouldn't say it's incontrovertible, but it's highly compatible. So with that, are there any questions?